an op-ed piece in the Friday's Wall Street Journal entitled "The Salvation of Napalm Girl" caught my eye. It was written by Kim Fook. There was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of her taken in 1972 when she was 9 years old. It's been shown many, many times. If you're not familiar with that picture of the Napalm Girl, you can just Google it and it'll come right up. It's a picture. She was running along a puddled roadway with arms outstretched, naked and shrieking in pain from napalm and fear, with a dark contour of a napalm cloud billowing in the distance. She shared in that op-ed story of her fear and bitterness and hatred to those responsible for the bombing and her pain and suffering. 45 years later, even now, she still has to get treatment for the burns she got in that attack in 1972. It turns out that 10 years later, in 1982, at a Christmas Eve service at a small Christian church in Vietnam, she was moved by God's Spirit and surrendered her life to Jesus. She wrote, "When I woke up that Christmas morning, I experienced my first ever heartfelt celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. I know what it is like to experience terror, to feel despondent, to live in fear. I know how wearying and hopeless life can be sometimes. After years of the spiritual wilderness, I felt the kind of healing that can only come from God." One of the phrases that jumped out from that op-ed article to me was, "to live in fear." There can be a lot of danger in the world. There always has been. In the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War and Vietnam, among many other things. Today, we face a dangerous world as well: terrorist attacks, mass shootings, threat of North Korea, as well as living through a divisive time in our own country with its attendant incivilities. I sense a lot of fear of people in the nation, if not up front, at least in the background. You just scratch a little bit beneath the surface, and there's fear. The truth of the matter is that no matter how secure we might feel in the moment, we're all vulnerable and weak people full of anxiety and fear. In fact, I would argue that the twins of anxiety and fear are major engines that drive much of our behavior. The weakness and vulnerability inherent to life cannot be thrown off. The ceaseless efforts to banish vulnerability accomplish no more than to make it change its form. We are fallible and finite beings living in a world that is, to a large degree, out of our control, and forces beyond our power. I went back and looked at the birth narratives of Jesus that are in Matthew and Luke, and I found that fear and anxiety plays a significant role in it. In Matthew 1:20, we are told Joseph was told not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife. In Matthew 2:13, Herod was frightened when he heard from the wise men that they were seeking a king. Now, Herod was a monster. He was guilty of murdering many, many people. He was in power at the time, so you would think, why would he be afraid? But it seems to be the more power we have, the more we're afraid that we're going to lose it. And so we're always trying to protect ourselves. Luke 1:12 says this: Zechariah is terrified with the angel's announcement that his wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and he will be John the Baptist. In Luke 1:29-30, the angel tells Mary not to be afraid. In Luke 1:65, Elizabeth's and Zechariah's neighbors had fear come over them when at John's circumcision, Zechariah regained his voice. He had been mute during the pregnancy. And then in Luke 2:9, it says, the shepherds were terrified by the angel's announcement. So fear is roaming around the Christmas story. We are in good company. Into this fear-filled world, God comes not as Superman, not as some Marvel comic book hero, but as a human baby. As one author has written, God became small and dirty. Mary gave birth in a stable. It could have been a cave, but it was hardly germ-free. God became small and dirty. I can't think of anything more vulnerable than a human baby. This has been renewed in my own thinking and my own experience with the birth of my granddaughter 11 months ago. Just reminded how totally vulnerable babies are. The solution, it turns out, is not to pretend to be invulnerable, not to rely on ideas and pursue paths that cannot ultimately protect us from our weaknesses and vulnerability, but to live vulnerably in intimacy with the God of love who comes to us in Jesus to embrace his wayward and rebellious children and to restore the relationship. God's word to us in Jesus is that nothing can separate us from God's love, that the peace and the joy that we so long for is gained in trusting in God's promise that God will never forsake or abandon us, no matter how dark or dangerous things may look. Rather than pretending that we are invulnerable or spending our lives pursuing different routes to feel invulnerable, we are invited to acknowledge and own our own vulnerability and weakness. As Kim Fook, the Napalm Girl, concludes her op-ed piece, she writes, "As Christmas approaches, I encourage you not to give up. Hold fast to hope. It is hope that will see you through. This peace I have found can be yours as well." God's word to us tonight is to find our security in the one who comes to us in vulnerability. Like the characters in the Christmas story, God's word to us is, do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David